Down in the bottom, children crying, crying for the sun. Down in the bottom. Welcome back to another episode of the Obscurity Spectrum podcast. I'm Jack.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're going to be talking about another set of albums that is, they're really important to us. We've had a lot of discussion about them before, just between ourselves, but we're going to discuss about them on here today. So the first discussion we're going to have is about the album Getz Gilberto, and that's an album that I picked for our mainstream segment of the show. So so the first album is Getz Gilberto. It's a bossa nova record from 1966. It features Stan Getz and Joao Gilberto. They play some original tracks, some covers, and there's obviously a lot of like bossa nova sentiments, some samba. It's a really, really relaxing record.
Right. And one of those covers you brought up that they do, The Girl from Ipanema, if I'm pronouncing that right, it's one of the most covered songs in all of recorded history. If Sinatra's done a cover, pretty much everyone under the sun has done a cover of Girl from Ipanema.
Oh, yeah. That song in particular, it's obviously one of the most well-known bossa nova songs and just pop songs in general. But what I really wanted to get into depth with about this particular album and bossa nova as a whole is that a lot of people consider bossa nova to be like, oh, it's just elevator music. It sounds so calming and there's not really much going on, but there is a lot of subtle intricacy throughout this music.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure anyone who's able to really listen to it and really hear stuff like the chords and the way that they change the like, I don't know, just the tempo. I don't even know how to describe it, but there's so much going on that we don't even realize when we don't look into it. But
right,
especially
at first listen, a lot of people may not really notice how intricate the recording is behind this album. Like you said, the chord changes, the way that they did Girl from Ipanema was in the key of D flat, I believe, but everyone else usually does it in the key of F, so it makes it sound a little more high pitch, a little more exciting. That's what Frank Sinatra did it as. And I like this version because it's a lot more, I guess, just cooled down. It sounds kind of haunting at points, but that's why I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, I can definitely understand the haunting sentiment. For instance, like when they go into the verse and then the bridge, that bridge part sounds so haunting, and it feels like you can physically feel that same yearning that the vocalists are talking about. And Joao Gilberto and his wife Astrid Gilberto both sing on this particular version of Girl from Ipanema. And what's interesting as well is that a lot of bossa nova music is in Portuguese, because obviously it's from Brazil. But
well, a lot of people don't even know that Brazilians speak Portuguese. I know plenty of people that think they speak Spanish or Brazilian, which isn't a language.
Exactly. Brazilians speak Portuguese, and what I think is interesting is that this version on this album, they switch between Portuguese and then Joao Gilberto's wife, Astrid Gilberto, she sings in English. And the single version only features her vocals, but the album version features both. And it gives it a little bit more of accessibility, obviously, to people and consumers in the U.S.
Right, while
And
still keeping that charm that it's famous for, not completely making it English like many other people have done.
very, yeah, exactly. So there's kind of a dichotomy there where you get the best of both worlds. And as for the rest of the album, I think there are even some tracks on there that go beyond just "Girl from Ipanema," because that's obviously "Girl from Ipanema" is a great, amazing song. It's one of my favorites, but at the same time, uh, it often gets put in front of other bossa nova classics, and um, I think that Getz Gilberto definitely goes beyond just what it's credit for "Girl from Ipanema." There's plenty of tracks on there like Corcovado and Desafinado that really encapsulate certain bossa nova moods in just as good, if not better, ways than "Girl from Ipanema."
Right, because if I'm remembering correctly, Corcovado's a lot more. Um, it's slower, if I remember correctly, and I think his wife sings on that one too, if I remember correctly. And that that track was probably one of my favorites from the album, tied with "Girl from Ipanema." Even though I really enjoyed "Girl from Ipanema," I do understand why you would put other songs over it on the album. It's that kind of sentiment that, it's so infamous and it has to be that good. When compared to other things on the album, it can kind of throw other stuff in its shadow.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah.
and you can go look, and there's so much other just as good stuff on this record.
It's a record that when you're listening to it, at least for when I listened to it the first time, I instantly fell in love with it. But then when I listened to it again, I just found even more things to love about it. It was just every time listening to this album, it's an experience for me. It's soothing, it's haunting, it's beautiful, and there aren't many genres that I can purely say can match this level of beauty. Like in this genre and this album alone, there's so many beautiful tracks, so many beautiful songs, and I mean, for songs like "So Danco Samba," I love "So Danco Samba." It just gets you in such a particular groove, and I really can't stress enough how important this album is to me as a bossa nova classic and for the entire genre of bossa nova as a whole.
Right, I completely agree, and I had listened to this a few times, but I never really indulged in it that much. And then whenever you recommended I listened to it, I started listening to it more. I paid attention to it more, and for some reason this time around, it just really, really stuck with me, and I ended up enjoying it greatly. And I've told you, you've kind of thrown me on a bossa nova kick lately, and I've started diving more into that genre. But I wanted to kind of loop back around to what we were talking about with Gilberto's wife. She was the only one who could sing in English in the recording studio, but she was also one of the few people who could speak both English and Portuguese. Now, what struck me as odd when I listened to this album, and then whenever I started reading about it, was that the chemistry between Getz and Gilberto is so in sync. It seems flawless.
Absolutely.
And then you go and you read, and apparently they would kind of go at it with each other. The language barrier, I'm sure, didn't help. But Gilberto would refer to Getz as gringo or worse at times, and they would kind of they would have to get him to calm down. They really apparently had chemistry problems, even though it's not apparent on the record. Which just baffles me, because there's so many albums like Pink Floyd's The Wall. You can hear the cracks forming between Waters and, I want to say Waters and Gilmour, but it's Waters and everyone in the band.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
As he's starting to distance himself and take over. But this really didn't show any signs of that, and that amazed me.
Yeah, I honestly didn't even realize that there was a rift between the two. Because it is so not apparent on the record. It is, in fact, you would think that they were the best of friends with the way they play and how they're in sync with each other.
Right, exactly. And as I read more and more into this, I found some other pretty interesting stuff in this time period up until I think like 1969 or 70. Every record was done in mono, or at least the majority of records were done in mono, and a stereo mix was really an afterthought. This album was recorded with a 3-track tape, so you had 3 different mono tracks where you had like the drums and the keyboards, the pianos in one track, you may have the voices in another, the saxophone and guitar in another, and that's how they would balance it for the stereo image on the record. And I was looking into a reissue done by a company called All Analog Productions, and it turns out every single copy of this album up until this reissue from a couple of years ago, the left and right channels were swapped. So what was in the left channel was supposed to be the right channel and vice versa. So apparently if you buy this new issue, you'll hear the album the way that the original mixing engineer intended it to sound, as far as the placement of the musicians whenever you get that stereo image from the record.
I'll have to definitely look into getting that then. That sounds like it would be a very interesting thing to hear.
Oh yeah, I'm tempted to bite the bullet. The only issue is that they're pricey reissues, because they do what Mobile Fidelity Sound Lab does, where they cut it as 245 RPM 12-inch records. So there's only like 1 or 2 songs on each side, and you're going to be getting up a lot to change them. But apparently the sound quality on these is phenomenal, and it's as close to them being in the room with you as you'll hear from this recording. But until then, a cheap copy I can probably find at the record store will be sufficient enough.
Absolutely. I think no matter what way you can listen to this album, you definitely should.
Right, I completely agree. No matter how you end up listening to this, whether you go pull it up on YouTube, even though it may be compressed, you go pull it up on Spotify, you find a beat-up record in a store somewhere, it's definitely an experience of an album. And I can't think of the last time I listened to an album either for the first time or I dug into it more, and it was a completely different experience listening to it. Not just listening to like a cluster of songs, just a completely immersive experience listening to it.
Yeah, there's not many albums with such a magical quality as this one, honestly. So
right, and there's a reason it won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year. And I think it was the only bossa nova one to win that. And that's what thrust it into the spotlight, the genre, I should say.
Yeah, I think I did read about that actually, but honestly, if that's all we had to say for this one, I think we can wrap up this segment. Oh
boy, and start diving into the worst stuff.
Yeah, so we're gonna play a song quickly, just to give you an idea of the album, and then we'll get right back to it.
So danço samba, vai, 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 vai. Só danço samba, vai. Só danço samba, vai, 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 vai. Só danço samba, vai. Já dancei o twist até demais, mas não sei, me cansei do calypso ao tchá-tchá-tchá. Só danço samba, vai, 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 vai. Só danço samba, vai.
Welcome back, everyone, and now we're on to the second album in what we deem the mainstream choices for our podcast. And the one I'm going to be dealing with, I think, came out about 5 years after Getz Gilberto, and whereas Jack's choice was very soothing and calming at points, mine's a complete acid trip and it's a nightmare. It's a blending of like J.R.R. Tolkien, a bunch of people doing acid in the recording studio. It's a disaster of an album, but I still love it. I still love it.
Absolutely.
That album is going to be Pink Floyd's debut, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Now, I'm sure you were like me, Jack, where when you got into prog and you first started with Pink Floyd, you probably started with what everyone does. You start with either Dark Side, Wish You Were Here, or The Wall.
You would definitely be correct in that assumption. I started with Dark Side.
I think I went to Dark Side second. I started with The Wall, and not just The Wall. I started with The Wall movie, which is kind of sensory overload at that point. But anyway, people usually kind of start in that same vein of Pink Floyd, and there's nothing wrong with that. And then as they start to move further into their discography, whether they move forward into like Momentary Lapse of Reason or Division Bell, or they fall back, where they go into metal, Obscured by Clouds. Mm-hmm. And then you get to their first album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which came out in 1967, so actually only 3 years, I think, after Getz Gilberto. This one's older than I thought it was. Wow.
Yeah.
It
was pretty early. I know
Jeez.
Saucerful, their second album came in 68, just 1 year later.
Right, yeah, that's right. So, for those that aren't familiar with Pink Floyd's start, they were led by a guy named Syd Barrett, and Syd Barrett left after Saucer Full of Secrets. He only wrote, I think, one song called Jug Band Blues while Saucer Full of Secrets. Mm-hmm. I don't think he contributed anything else. He was gone quick.
Yeah, and I think that was the last. I think that was not only the last song with Syd Barrett, but the only song where there was Syd Barrett and David Gilmour on the same track.
You're right. That's right. Because they brought in Gilmour for that. Because you can see in a live performance of that Jug Band Blues song, you see David Gilmour singing while playing the guitar, but Syd Barrett's voice is coming through the speakers. Because they would do that on those Top of the Pop shows. They would take the studio recording and put it over the video. So you have David Gilmour singing with Syd's voice.
Yeah.
But Syd pretty much did everything on Piper, except for, I think, Take Up Thy Stethoscope and Walk and Interstellar Overdrive, which were contributions by Roger Waters. Mm-hmm. Syd pretty much made the entirety of Piper. And where we were talking about how Getz Gilberto is more than just a collection of songs, it's a really nice whole piece that doesn't feel separated that much. Piper, as much as I love it, it just seems like such a conglomerate.
Absolutely.
A mess of songs. Man, oh man, it's nuts. It starts off, at least the UK pressing does, it starts off with Astronomy Domain, or Domine, however you pronounce it. And then it bleeds into like Matilda Mother, Lucifer Sam. And all these songs, as different as they sound, they all have that psychedelic touch that Syd was infamous for, with that kind of haunting Hammond organ in the background, that really distorted guitar that they would play with that. I guess you could call that vibrato effect.
Yeah. Like,
I suppose.
Kind of modulated.
Yeah. Piper is extremely unique because a lot of the Pink Floyd fan base believes that if Syd Barrett had stayed, they would have made such better albums. And I really have trouble seeing that.
Right. I personally, as much as I love Piper at the Gate, as much as I love the album, I don't see not only them becoming as commercially successful with David Gilmour and Roger Waters as a duo, being the main songwriters and everything, and especially with Roger Waters kind of taking control over the band during the
right.
Animals and the Wall period, and especially for the final cut. But
the final cut is just a Roger Waters solo album. Don't even call that a Pink Floyd album. You know it's just a Roger solo album.
It, but what I'm trying to say is that I don't think Sid, even if he didn't kind of go off the deep end mentally, he wouldn't have been able to propel them to what they became. And
right.
I'm not even just talking about commercially. I'm talking about musically, because the first two albums, especially Piper, they don't have they have a distinct sound, but they don't have a matured sound, if that makes sense. The album...
No, you're completely right.
Yeah, the album Piper has like a distinctive spacey kind of psychedelic sound that they would continue to take influence from. It was like their baseline, this spacey psychedelic sound. Even through Adam Hartmother, right, you can kind of still hear the remnants and resonance of that time. But
yeah, you hear the same thing on Soundtrack from the Film more with like Green is the Color and Cirrus Minor.
Yes, exactly. But Piper is since it is a Syd Barrett, it's a Syd Barrett project. It's a very very Syd-centric album that only he could have done like that. Only he could have wrote, and only he could have played it like that. And I think that everything after that particular album, not only did it allow Pink Floyd to come into form, but it distanced themselves from that original record. However, I do love the record so much. I think it sounds so interesting, especially compared to a lot of what was being made at the time. It's a really, really cool, influential record, because it has kind of like a spacey kind of rock sound. I think it definitely influenced space rock, which would come to form later with bands like Hawkwind and Gong.
Right. And the album, I think, saw a fair amount of success upon its release, mainly in the United Kingdom. But nonetheless, it still saw a good amount of success. And what's interesting is that I think this was the only Pink Floyd album that did what was infamous with like Beatles and Rolling Stones albums, where the UK and the US releases had different track listings. Because the UK one, which I think is the one like you've listened to, I listened to, the one pretty much everyone listens to, because that's what's on YouTube and Spotify, is the UK track listing, where, like we were saying, it starts off with Astronomy, then Matilda Mother, then Lucifer Sam, whereas the US copies put on like the single See Emily Play, and they took off Astronomy Don't Mind, they took off Bike, which ends the album. You can see that as a good or a bad thing. I think Bike is probably the weakest song on the album.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
But it's interesting that they chose to do that with only one of their albums, and they just kind of shuffled up the order a lot. And if they had done that with any other Pink Floyd album, I feel like it would have greatly disrupted the flow. But because this is such just more like a handful of songs that got dumped onto a record, it doesn't really seem to matter.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there.
Because they don't bleed into one another. They just are. Each one is its own independent thing, and that's really it.
Yeah. I think another really cool thing to note, with me being such a big Frank Zappa fan, is after I listened to Piper at the Gates of Dawn, I ended up getting recommended in my YouTube I don't know if you even knew about this, but there is a jam session with Pink Floyd during their like more psychedelic era. It wasn't with Sid, but it was shortly after David Gilmour joined the band. I think it was in early 1969 or late 1968.
So like Uma Guma era, probably.
Yeah, like right before then, where Pink Floyd was jamming with Frank Zappa, and they were jamming over Interstellar Overdrive.
Oh yeah, I saw that years ago in YouTube, and I haven't watched it in a long time. I know the video you're talking about.
I think something that's important to note for Pink Floyd as a band during the Piper era, and even through, I think honestly, if I'm going to be completely honest, Adam Heartmother to me is the first album from Pink Floyd that sounds like Pink Floyd.
I agree with you, and I think that was also their first album to top the UK charts.
Yeah. But I think something that really alerted me when I was watching the Frank Zappa performance is that obviously Frank Zappa didn't do drugs. I don't know if you knew that, but Frank Zappa was vehemently against drugs. But Pink...
You gotta be kidding me.
No.
How do you come up with some of that stuff?
Yeah, he's totally against drugs, and he banned his band members from using drugs.
Wow, that really is a shocker to me.
Right, but he when he jammed with Pink Floyd, everybody except for Frank Zappa on the stage was completely stoned. Roger Waters, he was definitely on something else. But I think what I'm trying to say here is that this period of the band marks an immaturity. It doesn't sound fully formed, as raw and energetic as it is. I love it, but I think it only gives a brief idea of their maturity to come.
And I think it pains me to say this, you're right, and that also applies to Sid's departure from the band, because it was that immaturity, that party culture, that recklessness, just going out to these random clubs in London and not really paying attention to your surroundings that caused him to deteriorate so fast. Because apparently what happened was that someone just handed him a drink and told him to drink it, and he did, and they had spiked his tea with acid, and apparently it was way too much, and that just that destroyed him. Roger Waters and Richard Wright have said in a few interviews that after that day, it's like someone went and just flicked a switch and turned the lights off behind his eyes.
Mm-hmm.
He was just gone. So it's that immaturity that makes the album so unique and not as polished, but that's also sadly what caused Sid to end up leaving the band, and a lot of people would disagree with me, but I think it was for the better.
Yeah.
That Sid left.
I would agree that Sid leaving was for the better for Pink Floyd as a whole.
Right. Now, the last thing I do want to bring up with this album is it's a lot like I already brought up Beatles and Stones. A lot of albums in this time period were mastered for mono. So the band members would stay with the sound engineer. They would spend hours doing these mono mixes of the album, and then they'd leave and the sound engineer would throw together a stereo mix in a couple of hours, and they didn't really pay much attention. So whereas the stereo plays nicely with like Interstellar Overdrive about halfway through, how it does that panning between speakers, as trippy and cool as that is, I'd argue that the mono mix is better, and they actually repressed it a few years ago for Record Store Day, and I need to go buy a copy secondhand because I couldn't find one.
Yeah, I was really wanting to get a copy of that record, and I remember sitting out in line at 5 o'clock in the morning, and there was actually like 40 people ahead of me when I got there at 5 o'clock in the morning. So,
man,
yeah,
I'm not surprised at all. That year was probably one of the biggest, and I think the following year was also big because they did the mono mix for Saucerful of Secrets, which is much cheaper, but apparently you also run the risk of getting a electronic disco dance club album on side B, because apparently a few of them use a wrong stamper. So the first side of that Record Store Day for Saucerful is regular Saucerful Secrets in the mono mix, and side B is this electronic club music.
That's actually kind of pitiful for a Record Store Day release.
Yeah, exactly. You think they would have more quality control.
Exactly.
But I think a good way to end this out is to play the mono mix of one of my favorite songs on the album. So we'll go ahead and play that, and we'll be right back.
All right, welcome back to the podcast. So this is the segment where we're gonna start talking about our more obscure choices for the podcast, and I'm gonna start off with an album that I've come to really love recently. I was told about this band. The band is called Yellow Magic Orchestra by a friend. He suggested that I listen to this band because I've been getting into a lot of electronic music lately. I just got myself some synthesizers. I've been playing some really yeah, multiple. But so this album was the first album I had heard by Yellow Magic Orchestra, and it's called Solid State Survivor. And the record is it's a masterpiece. It's absolutely amazing to me. It has a lot of the elements that Kraftwerk were messing around with at the time, that kind of like synth pop sentiment. But I think Yellow Magic Orchestra, and this is controversial, this will be controversial, and I think we will be canceled for this opinion.
Oh God, the cancel culture is coming for us.
That Yellow Magic I think that Yellow Magic Orchestra does synth pop better than Kraftwerk.
No, you're right. You're 100%
Now hear me
right.
out. I love Kraftwerk, and I'm sure anybody listening to this podcast would also love Kraftwerk. I mean, they're the pinnacle, and they're the most well-known synth pop band from the 70s and the 80s that they spearheaded the entire genre, and I will not deny that. However, with Yellow Magic Orchestra, I listened to their entire discography recently, and every single album is so well polished and so well done, and each album has kind of a different theme almost. I want to say the debut is more of like a computer game kind of theme. Like they took certain samples and stuff from computer games and made songs with that and made it sound like you were inside of a virtual world, almost like what Kraftwerk did with Computer World and Man Machine and stuff like that. But even from the get-go, Yellow Magic Orchestra have been super, super polished, and everything about them is perfect. Like everything from the production to the actual sounds used, I think they did it so
And
so
this was
well.
only their.
that-
Was this their first or their second album? I think their second.
Yeah, Solid State Survivor was the second album. That was more of a. Focused less on the computer game aspect and more on, I'd say. I'd even venture to say a folky electronic type of music, especially in songs like Insomnia.
And that's the weird thing is that this is only their second album, yet you pull Kraftwerk, who at this time has had maybe like 4 or 5 albums, and they were just getting to this point. You pick Kraftwerk's first 2 albums, you can tell they're still working out kinks. That's not to say that they sound bad, but you can tell they're still falling into the groove, trying to find the exact tone that they're trying to reach. Whereas Yellow Magic Orchestra, it's like they came out the gate full speed. It's so odd. It's like pulling like Rush's Permanent Waves or Moving Pictures as their very first album. There are very few bands that can reach such perfection in their quality this early in their career.
I totally agree, and I think it, to me, as someone who's listened to the entire discography of Yellow Magic Orchestra, it is actually hard to decide which of each of their albums is better. I don't know about you, but for most bands, I can say, oh, this album's better than this one. This album's better than this one. But Yellow Magic Orchestra, including Solid State Survivor, like everything was so well done, and each album had a purpose. It had a goal, and it fulfilled its goal by the end of the album. And I think it's an important thing when an album is such a coherent piece of it's a coherent piece of music from start to beginning. I think that while you can take certain songs from Solid State Survivor and listen to them on their own, I think they supplement each other. For instance, the beginning song is Technopolis or whatever it's called, and that leads into Absolute Ego Dance, and that song is so like it's just so I think it accomplishes what Kraftwerk wanted to do throughout. Like it makes me feel like I'm not only in like a virtual world, but I'm also dancing in a virtual world, if that makes any sense. But then it just flows through, and there's even a cover of the Beatles' Day Tripper on this album, and they did a fantastic job with it.
That was something that really struck me as odd, was that I saw the song Day Tripper, and I thought, oh, that's cute. They made a little homage with the name Day Tripper, and I listened to it, and I'm thinking, oh, crud, this really is Day Tripper. And it's so weird hearing it that way, but it was such a welcome change.
Absolutely. It was definitely a unique portrayal of the song, but unique in the best way possible. When I say unique, usually I'm like, oh, it was unique, but I like the original better. But this, I'd say it's on par with the original for being as good as it is. And taking its original form and putting it in a completely different context sounds great, especially with such professionals as Harumi Hosono, I think his name is. Haruomi.
I'm not even going to bother pronouncing that because I know I'm going to butcher
it. But yeah, and so again, what I wanted to focus on kind of for this discussion is the fact that every album by Yellow Magic Orchestra is so good. But what I think really stands out about this one is how not only does everything sound right where it's supposed to be, like everything falls into place perfectly. You can tell that the musicians on this project are perfectionists, but they were so ambitious for both this album and their debut album, which is a self-titled album. And I think from going from each of these songs, such as Absolute Ego Dance and Day Tripper, into something as as mystical sounding as the song Insomnia. That's one of my favorite songs on the record. If I had to choose one, I really can't because I love every single one. But Insomnia really sounds as if it's like I'm an insomniac listening to it. It has such a unique tone, and it incorporates Japanese folk elements into electronic
which is a pairing
music.
that you don't see.
And I
that
think that's
often.
so cool. Exactly, you don't see that very often. And also, mentioning other YMO albums, the album after this had such a different goal in mind. So it's a totally different sound. The album after this is called Multiplies, and they actually made it like a skit record. Like they had instrumental pieces that would serve as part of skits, and like in between each track there would be certain skits happening, like comedy skits, like actual comedy skits, both in Japanese and in English. And as much as I love that, and I wouldn't rank it poorly, actually. I'd say that album is nearly as good as this one, but this feels more like a perfectionist record. And I love humor in music, but this album comes off as more serious, and I like it for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that you preferred Insomnia from here, but after listening to this album a few times, I probably had to go with Rydeen, if that's if that's how I'm gonna pronounce it correctly. And it's that like running beat, like a running horse, that intrigued me so much, because I got a vibe of Emerson, Lake and Palmer's trilogy with the track Hoedown.
Yeah.
That really sucked me in. And whenever I was doing some research on this album, to read more into it, apparently Michael Jackson covered Behind the Mask off Thriller.
Huh.
I didn't know that. So
know that
even
either.
Michael Jackson knew this album.
Right.
And covered the song on Thriller, which is like, I think it's in the top 5 selling albums of all time, if not the top 3.
Yeah, for sure.
So
I didn't even know that. That's really interesting.
yeah, I had no idea about that, and I wasn't as familiar with Thriller, so that's why the song title didn't really stick out to me. But that just shows the outreach that these guys had. Mm-hmm. And it makes me wonder how much, as much as I love Kraftwerk's earlier albums, it makes me wonder how much better they could have been if they tackled their ideas with the same pretty much surgical precision that Yellow Magic Orchestra did with all their albums.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question, honestly.
And that's not to demean Kraftwerk, because Kraftwerk has had a great sweeping influence over this genre, arguably being the most popular. Mm-hmm. But still, I really wonder how much better their first few albums could have been if they had gone in with the same mindset and the same strength that Yellow Magic Orchestra seemed to have right out the gate.
Right. I mean, for instance, you don't really see Kraftwerk come into what they became until at earliest Autobahn. And that was 1974, right, when they started in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And their first couple albums were, I mean, they weren't even near what they ended up becoming in terms of content. They started off as like a krautrock, experimental rock kind of band. And then they shifted towards a more synthesized sound, and don't get me wrong, they sounded absolutely incredible, and obviously, Yellow Magic Orchestra were definitely influenced by Kraftwerk, and there's no denying that, but at the same time, it's like, I think Yellow Magic Orchestra took what Kraftwerk had been working on and ran with it to a degree where they propelled it even more.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, part of that could be attributed to Yellow Magic Orchestra had a later starting point and they kind of built upon Kraftwerk's foundation, but even so, to do it with the quality that they did is still extremely rare. I really can't think of another band that managed to do it like they did.
Oh yeah, for sure. And honestly, I hate to say it, but I prefer Yellow Magic Orchestra's discography to Kraftwerk's. After listening to every album, I don't think they made a bad album. Whereas I can say Kraftwerk has made like even mediocre albums. I don't think YMO made any mediocre albums. But as I said, like each record focuses on something different, whereas Kraftwerk never really focused completely, or once they got that electronic sound, they never really got off
ventured
of that
out their
focus.
comfort zone.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And that's what makes Yellow Magic Orchestra even more astounding, the fact that they kept that quality despite branching out.
Exactly. Yeah. And even with one of their last records, the pair of albums Naughty Boys and Instrumentals, it's like their album Naughty Boys is like it's more pop oriented for sure, and it actually most of Solid State Survivor has no vocals whatsoever, and the vocals that they do have are vocoded. So it sounds robotic and it sounds like I guess virtual. And that's what's an interesting part of the aesthetic, whereas in Naughty Boys, which is their last record, they have very little vocoded vocoded vocals, and throughout the entire record, they're actually singing without any sort of alterations to their voice. And you would think that a band that starts off with a record with completely vocoded vocals with their debut and their second record wouldn't be able to sing well, but these guys are they're phenomenal in just every aspect, and I think it's just interesting how they portray themselves, and I think it's a good way to go into it, thinking that YMO are not just jack of all trades, but they're masters at everything they did throughout their career, in my opinion.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that sentiment, and I need to dive more into their albums. I've been meaning to get more into this electronic pop kind of genre, and you've given me a lot of material to go off of.
Absolutely. So, honestly, is there anything else you want to talk about in terms of wrapping this one up?
No, I think we pretty much covered everything. I'm just tempted to not let this in because we're going to be diving into my choice for the Obscurities next, and the album art alone is enough to scare people off.
Yeah, so we'll get to that right after we play a song from Solid State Survivor.
All right, welcome back, everybody, and it's time for the final of our albums from this episode, and it's one of my favorite of these really obscure blues, psychedelic albums from, I believe, 1969, just that late 60s period, and it's called Walpurgis by The Shiver. Now, what struck me about the album cover is something that you wouldn't really find disturbing, Jack, because you know I like these kind of album covers as it is.
Yeah, of course.
But for those of you who aren't familiar with an artist named H.R. Geiger, this was his first album cover, and he would go on to do a few others. But what he was most notable for was creating the xenomorphs, the face huggers, everything that has to do with Ridley Scott's Alien from, I believe, 1978, 1979, thereabout. Mm-hmm. So it's no shocker that on the front of the cover, there's these like semi-nude women with what looks like face huggers on top of their heads. And I mean,
that's really not
even
surprising.
Today that would disturb some people, but think about this coming out in 1969 and it just scares people, especially naming it after Walpurgis, which up until that point had become a pagan holiday obsessed with like celebrating a dark feast and stuff. And imagine a name like that with an album cover like this, and it's no wonder it got thrown into obscurity.
Yeah, when you put it like that, absolutely.
But it's a blending of their own original songs, and it starts off with a cover of Procol Harum's Repent Walpurgis, whereas I imagine you enjoy Procol Harum like me for the same reasons, that very not garage, I guess, sounding psychedelia like you would get from 13th Floor Elevators or the Stooges, but still that rough, deep psychedelic sound where it's not real clean or anything. It sounds kind of low quality at points, which just adds to the quality. And they took that
in a way.
They took that even further with this song.
For sure. And that's definitely a kind of similarity you can draw between the two. Like Procol Harum, I think their debut album is my favorite from them. And for a song such as like Conquistador, you have that it's not perfect. It's not a perfect sounding song, but it is so it brings such like a trance-like state over me because it sounds so intriguing, and I think I can definitely hear the same kind of sentiment with this album.
Right, and what's odd is that the entire album isn't like that. The first track starts off like that, which plays big off the psychedelic guitars, and one of my favorite instruments from this time period, that really smoky, foreboding Hammond organ that they would have in the background. I think that's one of the best atmospheric instruments that bands from this time period could play.
Oh, absolutely. It's like such a staple of the time, and even though now it might sound a little dated, I personally still love it to this day, and I don't think it sounds dated.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. There are still some musicians that will use a Hammond organ, and it excites me when I hear that. It's severely underused. And to dive kind of deeper into this album, it has that opening track. Then it goes into something called Ode to the Salvation Army, which is like a little short 40-second soft. I'm pretty sure it's an instrumental song. And then they kind of go into this kind of poppy song called Leave This Man Alone. And what ends the first side of the album is one of my favorite tracks, and it ends up repeating itself as a more upbeat version called The Peddle, which ends the second side. But what ends the first side is called What's Wrong About the Blues, and it's a very dirty sounding song, from the heavy emphasis on organ and keyboards to the harmonica that they bring in. It's one of my favorites on the album, if not my absolute favorite. It and The Peddle are tied, but then again, they're pretty much the same song, just one without lyrics and a little more upbeat.
Yeah. I think what's interesting to note about the album as compared to a lot of blues records at the time, I found there to be some like progressive sentiments like on top of the blues.
Right.
Obviously, you have your psychedelic rock, and that is highly blues influenced. Like, for instance, like Blue Cheer. Blue Cheer is a great band to reference for a bluesy psychedelic rock band. But on top of the bluesy kind of sound that you find in this album, you get some proto-progressive, actual, really interesting sounds that aren't really as common in 1969.
Right. And they were pretty ahead of their time, even given the other similar artists that were working within this vein at the time. And I would peg a lot of their, or pin a lot of their failure commercially on the album cover, because I recently got a vinyl repressing. I think it's German, and they have a booklet, and inside it shows a picture of them appearing on Swiss television performing, and I have a feeling that one of two things happened, or a combination of both, where people saw them on TV, they thought, you know what, I kind of like this sound, and they went to a record store and they either A, didn't have the album because they didn't press that many copies, or they saw the album cover and and the parents got scared off, or whoever was buying it got scared off, and for good reason. It's an extremely disturbing album cover, and that's why I love it.
Yeah, I love that kind of thing too. It really encapsulates the sound of the album to me, despite the album cover being kind of horrifying. I think it's perfect.
Yeah, I think it's perfect too. And that's why I love H.R. Geiger's album covers so much, is that he always seemed to capture the mood perfectly.
Yeah, especially with he has such a specific style.
Right, that kind of like, it's hard to describe his style. It's like an organic, dark steampunk kind of thing, because he has that metal work, but he blends it into these organic textures, and it's so discomforting at times, yet you can't look away.
Right. Yeah, and I think one of the first times I had ever seen that, besides like the film Alien and everything, was Emerson, Lake and Palmer's Brain Salad Surgery.
That's right.
You have that.
How could I forget? That's probably his most famous album cover, was Brain Salad Surgery.
Yeah, where you have the original record where it's like a skull and there's a face under the skull, and then you open it up and it's this woman under all this, like the front cover, it had all this, machinery
surrounding it, and there's like a magnifying glass, or like a glass portal over the mouth.
Yeah. But still, it actually captures the essence of the album perfectly, despite it being such a specific aesthetic. Right,
which is odd, because a lot of times bands would be given album covers where whoever designed it was just told, hey, here's the album. Well, what's it about? I don't know, just do a cover. That happened with Steely Dan's The Royal Scam. They were given an album cover that was rejected by Van Morrison, that the band hated. There are a lot of bands where the album cover designer would just kind of do something random that he thought looked cool, but it wouldn't match the tone of the album. And whether or not H.R. Geiger was actually trying to match the tone of the album or not, it seems like every single time he's done an album cover, he manages to capture the mood flawlessly.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And this album really is no exception. Because the album, as well as the cover, have kind of a gritty, rough look to it. Look and sound. And I think that the tone of the guitars and the kind of muddiness to the music really brings that out. And I think it's a really, really good cut. It's a really, really good record. And the album itself, the cover really just matches it. I don't even know how to explain it, but I suggest listening to it, looking at the cover, and just making that connection yourself, because to me it totally works.
Right, it just brings it to a whole other level. And I'm pretty sure someone's uploaded the entire album to YouTube, but I've had the album digitally on my phone, and I've wanted to get an actual vinyl pressing for a while. And like pretty much a lot of the albums you and I are into, original copies fetch hundreds of dollars. The original Swiss press, I think right now on either eBay or Discogs, the cheapest copy you can get is like $700 or something. So I got it like a $20 picture disc, and that's good enough for me.
Yeah, anything to save $680.
Yeah, yeah, really. And I think to end it all out, I'd like to play what I think the best symbol for this album. Even though it's not the heaviest song, it's what helps give what I feel is the overall atmosphere of the album, and that would be this really bluesy, drag-out song called The Peddle.
All right, welcome back. We're gonna sum all this up by rating every album that we've covered today. So obviously we're gonna start with Getz Gilberto by Stan Getz and Joao Gilberto.
Man, how did we go from Walpurgis back to Getz Gilberto? That's such a genre jump.
It's pretty much the opposite of each other if you think about it. But Getz Gilberto. Really. It's such a special record to me. It's probably one of my favorites of the bossa nova genre, if not my favorite. So I'm going to have to rate it really highly. I'm going to go for a 9.5 out of 10 on this one. What do you think, Mike?
I'm pretty close to you. Close enough for government work. I'm going to give it a 9.3. I understand you enjoy it a lot more, and I feel like I would rate it higher if I spend even more time with it and dive into the bossa nova genre more.
Yeah, that's a pretty fair statement, especially with I've come to grow so fond of bossa nova as a whole. It's one of my favorite genres of all time.
So now let's go back to the other mainstream album that we covered, and that would be Pink Floyd's debut, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And I know you and I both came to an agreement on the statement that despite how much we enjoy the album, it seems kind of more like a collection of songs at point. It does have a sense of immaturity to it, and despite that, I'm waiting to see how far or close our ratings come out. I'm leaning to about a 9 out of 10 on it, because despite the immaturity that they showed, it's one of the most unique psychedelic records that's ever been recorded. And even without the Pink Floyd name attached, I still think just the uniqueness of this album helps it stand out a lot.
Yeah, that's definitely fair to say, and I totally agree with the sentiment of being a very unique and interesting psychedelic record at the time. My rating is pretty close. It's not the closest. It's not as close as last time, But I'd rate this album 8.5 out of 10, and that's a pretty solid rating.
8.5. That's pretty close, because last time you and I had a separation of a whole point on Brighter Later.
That is true. That is true.
I think Deceit, I had like a 1.8 difference on you, so we're getting a lot closer this time around.
This time around, it might change next episode, but 8.5 out of 10 is including the fact that I definitely hear that immaturity, and it leaves a little bit for me to be desired when listening to the album as much as I love
desired. What, you don't like hearing Syd Barrett talk about that little gnome named Grimble Crumble or whatever who went and built his own? I love that song, but good lord, I can't stand listening to it sometimes. It's so wacky.
It's just, to me, there are other psychedelic records from the time, especially in 1967, that I preferred the sound of, and I also prefer Pink Floyd's later work.
Right.
Just to be fair and honest, but 8.5 is what I give it. So that kind of leads us over to the obscure section of our review, and so I will be doing YMO Solid State Survivor next. And to me, just like last time, the more obscure album I would give a 10 out of 10, just because it is in my, as of right now, for sure, this album has been in my top 10 ever since I listened to it for the first time.
Man, you're throwing it another 10?
Yeah, I have to give it to him.
Man, I still haven't gotten a 10.
And look, I don't give out 10s lightly, but I guess it's just this particular album is so fantastic, so perfect. But yeah, it's.
So we're going to come to that point difference again, and that's the thing. I'm mainly giving it this because of I respect what they do. I really, really do. But this is just not my kind of cup of tea. And if I spend more time with it, I can guarantee you, like Getz Gilberto, that rating may go up. Although I have a feeling this one would change a lot more. I'm going to have to give it an 8.7 right now. Shame me as you will. Shame me as you will.
That's fair. Honestly, I can imagine that it's not perfect for everyone, but to me, and especially with YMO becoming one of my favorite bands, this record is as perfect as you can get in this context.
All right,
for me,
I respect that. Just be careful. You hand out another 10 out of 10. We're gonna have a serious talk about this. You giving them out like candy.
Trust me, I don't give them out easy, but these guys just deserve it, in my opinion. But so
well, yeah, it depends what album I choose for the next episode. If I go with the one I'm thinking of, I may be giving out my first 10 next episode.
Yeah,
I'll let you try and figure that one out if you can. So
I'm pretty sure
that leads us into Walpurgis. And this is a lot like Piper, where I'm wondering how much we're going to differ again. I love this kind of dirty, dark, blues-driven, organ-driven album from this time period. And I wish that there were a few more like it. And despite the weakness that some of the songs have, I feel that the album's strong points are strong enough where they kind of overpower the weaker songs, like Leave This Man Alone and Hey Mr. Holy Man. And I'm probably going to give Walpurgis about an 8.7. So same as Yellow Magic Orchestra's Solid State Survivor. And I can just hear over the microphone that you're seething with rage that I said that.
No, I can understand it. I will happen to say, though, that there is I wouldn't say super significant point difference, but significant enough. Personally, due to what you mentioned, the album does have some low points. I really liked the high points, like you said, although they don't quite weigh out as much for me as they do for you. So with that in mind, I will give this record an 8 out of 10. And 8 out of 10.
Respectable.
It's, as I said, it's a really solid record. It's really solid. It's just, to me, I probably have to listen to it again, listen to it a couple times to really absorb it. As Mike said, yeah, so I'm not really into blues as much. I said this last episode. I'm not really into blues as much as Mike would be, especially tinged with prog and psychedelic. I think that's totally up your alley.
Tinged with prog. This is intertwined and had an illegitimate child with prog at points.
Yeah, pretty much. But yeah, 8 out of 10. As I said, I think I need to revisit this again, and it might go up, but 8 out of 10 is my rating for now.
Hey, I'll say the same thing about Solid State Survivor. I probably need to revisit it, and I'll improve my rating. That being said, you and I always seem to have a good difference when it comes to our obscure ones. I think the next episode I'm going to pick one of your favorites that I just got a copy of off of Discogs, and I have a feeling you know which one I'm talking about, don't you?
I know exactly which one you're talking about. But for the audience, we're gonna leave it for we're gonna leave that one. To the next episode.
The 5 people that are listening right now. Ooh. All right.
Yep,
well,
exactly.
I guess that wraps it up for today.
Yeah. So thanks for tuning in to our podcast, The Obscurity Spectrum. And this is Jack, and I'm signing off.
And this is Mike signing off. See y'all next time.
Goodbye.